for this week. But as we get started on it, one of the things I wanted to do is just review some of the key things about last week that we talked about. And we talked about this kind of a challenge, or sort of a see if you can remember to do this the next time you feel that you're having any kind of a difficult emotional experience. So whether it's stress, anxiety, anger, fear, anything that you would just consider, a difficult, unpleasant emotional state. If at any time you're experiencing that, see if you can remember to check your breath and see what's going on with your respiration at that time. And so I don't know if anybody had any opportunities to do that or had any success with it, but it really is amazing to check in and notice that, yeah, if I'm feeling anxious or uptight, every time I look, my breath is restricted in some way, it's tight in some way, I'm holding it a little bit, holding it for a couple seconds and then breathing shallow breaths. Some of this irregularity of the breath, it's just amazing to notice that.
Mine.
Were you?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Not myself.
and did you notice that a few times, kind of more than?
Yeah, because my head kept popping back to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd listen to your voice again, and then I'd be back to square one where I was fine.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting to notice that about yourself, that when there's tension there, that there is this connection between the breath and the tension,
Right.
or between the fear, there's a connection. The fear, the breath becomes irregular. Anger, the breath becomes irregular. With regular meditation practice, in general, you start to be just a little less fearful, a little less anxious, and a little less uptight. Over time, definitely helps. But of course, you're still human, and so things still come up that upset you or worry you or cause you emotional difficulty. And so this is a great thing to just keep in mind. But then it doesn't end there. As I say, you become aware of the breath being irregular. So there's that, you notice that connection. And then the thing to do is to make the breath be regular again. Allow the breath to return to being regular. And so you find that sort of like tension in the body, that any irregularity in the breath is something that you're causing, the irregularity. And the natural state of breath is to just flow fully and naturally, kind of as you would when you're sleeping. Mm-hmm. So when you're sleeping, you're completely relaxed, and you're not, your breath is very full and natural. That's one thing I notice, and you've probably noticed this if you've been near someone who's fallen asleep. And a lot of times you can tell when they've finally fallen asleep because the breath changes. You can hear them breathing deeper, or hear them breathing fuller. A lot of times with little kids, you can tell when they dozed off finally because the breath would change. And then you knew, okay, yeah, I probably have a few minutes of break here because they finally dozed off, real good this time. So yeah, just being aware of the breath and then allowing it to return. And in some ways, kind of, I use the word making it. It's not as forceful as making it, but sometimes it needs some guidance. I see that my breath is restricted, so full in breath, full out breath, and then observe that. And then the other thing is, in observing that breath, allowing it to return to normal, then really focus on it with that attentive awareness so that you're observing, okay, the breath is regular again, it's full again, but let me observe the breath, the sensations of the breath, the movement of the breath, the touch of the breath. Let me observe that as I'm here with it. And that, with all of that, a lot of times we'll notice, boy, I've really created some space here between me and this thing that I was anxious about or worried about or angry about. And that spaciousness can make all the difference in the world, because it can be the difference between you reacting out of fear or out of anger, or whatever it is, and instead, in just that little bit of space, choosing something that's going to be a better, a better path. Not hollering at somebody, not getting so fearful, being a little more, sometimes some self-talk, hey, I'm thinking about a lot of things that there's no proof of this being true, but you know how the mind is when you're fearful. You imagine all these difficult things, and then at some point you just have to say, oh no, you need to come back to the here and now. I had mentioned our daughter went to Africa, and she's at a refugee camp doing some volunteer work for a period of time. And, that's a particularly volatile area. And, we all read news stories and we hear about things. And so there is a part of the parent mind and the human mind that sort of goes to the, oh, what if? Yeah, what if something horrible happens? And then and then as you're going through that, you're kind of thinking about, what if something horrible happened? How would I deal with it? What would I do? What would I say? You are sort of, on some level, actually having that reaction as if it was really happening. Mm-hmm. And then you have to kind of, at some point, you become aware of that, and it's like, oh yeah, this is not what's happening. This is not, this is not the reality of this moment. Let me come back to what is actually happening. So there is a reality that she's in Africa at a refugee camp where things can be dangerous. But beyond that, there's nothing else to add. She's intelligent, she's with other people, she's, following a program where, there's some safety and so forth. So, beyond that, you can't control it.
No.
And so you have to just sort of allow it to be as it is. Because the alternative is to really just tear yourself up, which is what we so often do. But yeah, as I say, the thing we notice most often just doing that simple practice is that whatever the difficult emotion was seems to have sometimes just kind of dissolved away. Sometimes it gets a little softer. Sometimes it just feels like it's not on top of you. So you have some room to breathe and you have some room to move. So that's kind of just a review of what we talked about last week. And this week, what I have in the handout, the title of the handout is to look inside. And the thing we do at the beginning of our meditation practice each week is the bell rings, and once the bell goes silent, sometimes we find ourselves, well, what's next? What do I do now? And it's almost like there's two options. I can either start being curious about the world around me, or I can maybe move my attention inward, move my senses inward, become aware of what's happening inside. And that's really where we do our practice of meditation, the work within the body and within the mind. And since that's where we live, it makes sense to do it there. And since that's where our difficulties occur, it makes sense to do it there. So looking inside. But to kind of pick up on what we did last week with that breath exercise is, whenever you feel one of those difficult emotions, unhappy, angry, miserable, fearful, anything that you'd call a difficult emotion or an unpleasant emotion, sometimes we refer to them as afflictive emotions, just the stuff that's hard for us. Notice how the normal habit pattern of the mind is to react. That stuff comes up, the habit of the mind is to react. And it seems to start to happen kind of before we even notice, before we can intervene. The mind starts to react. And typical reactions, those habitual reactions, tend to come up as things like I want this, or I don't want that. So again, in the example of, thinking about my daughter, and then when the fearful, habit energy of the mind kicks in, and I start thinking about some of those worst case scenarios, there's a lot of, well, here's what I want. What I want, of course I want her to come home safe, but really I didn't want her to go in the first place, and I want her to be safe, and I want her to be home. And that's one of the things we notice when we start to look inside, is that around a lot of those afflictive emotional states, there's I want, I don't want, I want this to be this way, I don't want it to be that way. There's really this focus on the I. And in some ways, that's kind of the conventional way that we speak about ourselves and talk about ourselves. And so, yeah, that, I get that. That's part of the human, or that's part of the English language, the way we talk about that. And, but it's just something to be aware of at this point in time. And then I'll continue. So again, those are just kind of the habits. Difficult emotions come up, things that worry us, things that trouble us, our typical reactions as a response or as a reaction to those things are, I don't want this, I want this, I want that, and always with the I, always with the I. Every reaction is ultimately a derivative of wanting or not wanting on some level. Wanting or not wanting on some level. So think of other ways that you might phrase that. Wanting and not wanting. Sometimes we call it craving and aversion. Sometimes we call it attachment. Sometimes we call it liking and disliking in kind of a milder sense. I left my wife a note last week on the kitchen counter. She gets up like at 4:30 in the morning to go exercise. Sometimes I leave her a note. So I left the note. I like you, period. Do you like me? Question mark. And then I put 3 circles, yes, no, and maybe. And so that was the note. It just sort of, yeah, so that was the note.
Yes, do you want to hold hands?
But so, on a simple level, I'm not suggesting that, you should be uptight about, everything you like and everything you dislike and this kind of a thing. But what it is we start to become aware of, just like we became aware of how I can't sit still for very long without my mind wanting to head somewhere else or to go away from whatever it is I'm asking it to focus on. My mind wants to go somewhere. And when it goes somewhere, what is it doing? And noticing, just becoming aware of the fact that when there are unpleasant emotions occurring, a lot of times it is rooted in this sense of, I want this to be this way, and I don't want it to be that way, and I wish it was like this, and I wish that didn't happen, and all these different permutations of kind of the same wanting and not wanting. So that's something we become aware of. And then we also become aware of, well, how do those reactions feel when I feel like I want or I don't want? Does just that kind of objectively looking at that feeling of wanting and not wanting, how does that feel? Kind of the feeling tone of wanting and the feeling tone of not wanting. Sort of regardless of what it is, but when there's a real strong, intense wanting or not wanting, how does that feel? So does it feel light or pleasant or free, or does it feel like something else? And we start to become aware of, the real intense wanting, the real intense not wanting, that reactive mind, that feels cumbersome. We feel uptight, we feel unpleasant, or we feel there's a little dis-ease with it. Even if it's wanting something that you think is really cool. You know, like if you see a child in the store who wants a toy, that experience is so intense for them that wanting is not a pleasant sensation. I mean, a lot of times they're crying because of it, you know, or things that I want. Even as an adult, we learn to delay. In many cases, we learn to delay our gratification. Sometimes not, but in many cases we do. And we can experience how that intense feeling of wanting something that isn't there, how that can make us feel out of balance and just a sense of dis-ease. And so even something as simple, and I use ice cream a lot as, you know, like an example, because that's one of my, you know, that's one of my weaknesses, is if I want ice cream. And if let's say it's 9:30 at night and I don't want to go out, but I really have this craving for ice cream. That's a simple thing, and it's something that's kind of funny, but what does it feel like? I mean, that kind of is an annoying feeling. I want something that I don't have, and I really want it, but I don't want to have to go get it, and so that feels, it just feels a little, yeah. And so that's a simple thing, but then, you know, that's the habit pattern of the mind, is kind of to always be wanting and not wanting. And you could even say that feelings of, you know, guilt or regret about things in the past, that, boy, you know, I wish I would have done that differently. I wish I would have said that another way. You know, I wish I wouldn't have been mean to that person at this, you know, that kind of a thing. Or, boy, if only I had have said yes to that, things would be better. Or if in the future, if only this would happen, then things would be good, and then I could really start to live the life that I want to live. And so we just become aware of that habit pattern of the mind, to be in that reactionary, I want, I don't want, I want this, I don't want that, and what the feeling is around that wanting. And that feeling is usually an uptightness, a dis-ease, a dissatisfaction, sometimes a real rage. Sometimes, you know, like in the case of addiction, that feeling of wanting, that turns into incredible anguish, you know, in the case of addictions. So that feeling is there, along with wanting and not wanting. And so part of this is to be objective enough and to observe enough to start to notice just that tendency, that habit pattern within ourselves, but then also to not judge it and say, okay, every time I want something, that means I'm being dumb, or I'm being a bad person, or I'm destined for, you know, problems. But no, it's to start to be aware of this and what it feels like around it. There's just a quick, short quote. This is by a meditation teacher named Osho. He says, "Love is happy when it's able to give something. The ego is happy when it is able to take something." So I'll read that again. Love is happy when it is able to give something. The ego is happy when it is able to take something. And yeah, I think that's neat. Yeah, Osho is a neat guy. He's, I believe he passed away in the 90s, but he was a fairly popular meditation teacher, and he was one of these kind of neat, you know, he sort of looked like you would kind of want a guru to look. He was sort of a, you know, Indian-looking man. He had the long hair. He had the, you know, wonderful gray, silver, big beard. He wore a hat. And he was just sort of a, you know, just a neat-looking person, but wonderful teacher. But with that, you know, he's talking about something called the ego. We're so used to the feeling of an I that wants, and in many regards it's because that's the convention we have for being able to describe ourselves, for being able to talk about what our plans are, and you know, things like this. So it's good to have a healthy ego. It's good to have a healthy ego, a healthy sense of self. But But I think it's interesting in Japanese culture, for example, you will almost never be in a conversation with somebody where they say I. You know, it's kind of understood what you're talking about, but it's interesting to me how their language is in many ways built around this not trying to generate intense ego or intense feeling of selfishness, but it's it's understood that there's an I, but it's not discussed overtly. It's kind of an interesting thing. So we're used to that feeling of an I that wants or that doesn't want, but we never ask the question, who is the I that's wanting? And who is the I that's not wanting? And in many ways, that I is an idea. And here's kind of a cheesy prop that I'll show you. But I was thinking about this today, and I thought, now, when I'm talking about the I as an idea, I'm not saying that we don't exist, but because we do, obviously, we're here. Here we all are. We're real. We are here. We exist. There is an I. But if you think about sort of what the I is for a lot of us, we have experience upon experience upon experience. We have things that we believe in and don't believe in, things we like, things we dislike, things we want, things we don't want. We have memories, and we have the ability to project our memories into the future, and so there's kind of this continuity of awareness, and really around that we get this sense of I. And sometimes we have this experience in our own lives, or we'll witness it in others, where somebody's had a traumatic experience in the past, and that traumatic experience in the past really is who they are now. You know, they're sort of bringing that with them into the present moment. And so, or the things that we want, or the things that we identify with, we bring them forward into the present moment, and they're sort of, that's what our I is. That's our idea of I. So I thought of it as something as simple as, you could say, you know, that place in the mind where we have this continuity of awareness. There's memory, there's the ability to project into the future, and there's sort of experience piled upon experience, and we could just say, okay, that's the ego, that's the I, it's the sense of I, and it's really sort of like just an empty file folder. And when we're born, you know, it truly is empty, and then as time goes by, we start to fill it up. And so I just grabbed some different scraps of paper as an illustration, and again, it's kind of a cheesy prop, but, you know, I mean, if you have this thing where I will feel a lot better when I make a lot of money, and then that, you know, that's an idea you have, and for you that's a real idea, and it goes in there, it goes in that little folder. And then you think to yourself, you know, I did some things that I really regret in the past, and I feel guilty about that. I feel guilty about that today. And so that guilt sort of clouds my experience of joy now. And so that's one, and it kind of goes in there. And then you might look at some group of people, and you might say, you know, I really dislike that whole group of people. That's, you know, that's my belief. I have this, you know, bigoted belief or this racist belief. And so there's another one, and that kind of goes in there. And as time goes by, you're adding experience upon experience, belief upon belief, wanting, not wanting, all of these different things. And they're just getting added to this folder. And so now you get to the point where you're in the present moment, and the habit tendency of the mind is to want to, rather than just look around and experience what is true in this present moment, is to always kind of want to go back and re-reference. Well, you know, what is happening now compared to my belief that my life will be better if I have a lot of money? So let me just compare what's happening now to that belief. Okay, I don't have as much money as I wanted, so therefore things must not be as good as they could be. So it's like this simple belief, but it has absolutely no bearing on reality. You know what I'm saying? But because we took it on as one of our beliefs, it's part of our sense of I, kind of part of our ego, and so we hang on to that, and we kind of judge everything by that. Or at some point in time, we had this idea that some group of people we don't like, and so so now, as we navigate through life, we see people from all different groups, and so maybe we're judging people based on, well, I don't like them because of who they are, and this is where it is. So we're kind of living in that sense of the I, which is like this file folder of all these ideas and memories and values and things like that. Now, not all of them are negative. Not all of them are bad. But what if you were able to just say, okay, this is going to be something that I'm going to file for useful reference, because I do have this memory, and I've learned a lot from the things that I've screwed up in my life. And some of the things that I've done and said, yeah, I could say that I feel guilty about them, but what I would rather do is to learn from them and then to move into the next moment of my life having learned from those experiences and really try and be as kind and as loving and as genuine as I can. And then where I find that I can't be, then I just, move on to another situation. But you see what I mean? It's like using this as a reference, using this as something, what can I go back and just use this as a helpful reference for, rather than letting this define who I am right now. Because we find if I take this and just put it down, what's my experience of the present moment now? If I'm just opening up to it and experiencing it as it is. And so if my ego, my I, wanted me to have money and compares everything to whether or not that happened, I will always be unhappy because I'll never have enough. But right now, I'm sitting here, and what does money have to do with this experience? Nothing. But if I superimpose this idea on top of the experience, then the experience is lacking in some way. Does that make sense? So it's just sort of looking at, what is this I? What is this I? Is it really just a whole bunch of ideas that I sort of drag around, and then when real life is in front of me, I say, wait a second. Somebody says, isn't this fun? Well, wait a minute, I'll tell you. According to, no, it's not. It's not fun. Sorry, because I have this experience, and so this is telling me, no, it's not fun. Because I don't have enough money, according to, this one. Not enough money. No fun. But really, what's the experience? So it's kind of looking at the I in a somewhat playfully critical way, but also in a way that really sort of opens yourself up to, what is this that I'm dragging along with me all the time, that colors all of my experiences, and that I use to judge everything, and that I use to create separation between myself and other people? What is that? Is that even a real thing, or is it just ideas? I mean, I'm real, body's here, mind's here, all this, yeah, this is all real. But what is that ego? And so, just thinking about it as an idea. The I is a lot of ideas in a folder. And one thing we know about ideas is that they change constantly. Not many of our ideas are the same today as they were 10 years ago, or 10 days ago, or 10 minutes ago. I mean, ideas are changing all the time because we learn new things. Values change. These are all ideas, But I mean, there really was a time in my life, quite honestly, where I judged everything based on, I want to make a certain amount of money, and that's what's important, and I need to have this level of material success. And so that really did become the way I would evaluate every experience. And then consequently, it became the way that I would judge everyone else, right? Because if this is the way I judge myself, I have to judge others the same way. I mean, it's just the way the mind works. But it's interesting to just notice how ideas change all the time. Even things as fundamental as people's religious beliefs. People go through conversions, or they change, or they, different things happen. or certainly ideas about the body. At one time I had certain ideas about my body and my appearance, and now my ideas about that are quite different. And I'm sure that 10 years from now they'll be quite different again. And if I stop for ice cream on the way home, they'll be different again.
Culver's is almost open.
I know, and that's
You're at the walking distance of that.
I am, and they probably should have had a public meeting to see, is this going to be a problem for anybody? Yeah, French fries and ice cream. So, and another thing we know about ideas is that they are also very subjective. So I might think something is a great idea, while somebody else thinks it's not a great idea, right? Just objectively. I mean, we see that all the time. I think something's a great idea, somebody else doesn't. We see that real clearly in politics. One political party might think doing this as a policy would be a great idea. The other might say, well, that's really a bad idea, And both people, are probably equally honestly that they think that is a good idea or a bad idea. And, and so these ideas can be subjective. When we experience that strong sense of I want this or I don't want that, how does that affect the way we feel about other people or even the world around us? Does it normally make us feel more or less compassionate? And the answer, of course, is it makes us feel less compassionate. The stronger that idea of wanting and not wanting, the stronger the ego, this really puts in motion the pieces for us to be in competition, with others for resources. It puts us in, well, I need this, and in order to get it, I need to keep you from getting it. Or I might need more, but I need to protect it from you, this kind of a thing. So there, in some subtle ways, and even some overt ways, there's this, the stronger the feeling of I, we start to kind of want to put a little distance between us and the rest of the world or other people. And does it normally make us more kind or less kind? It's interesting to see how sometimes people with very little in the way of resources are incredibly generous because, they're not in this mode of greed, Or sometimes you'll see people who have so much, but they're just really stingy, and that's just a real restriction. And then, of course, does it make us feel more or less peaceful? And you can really see that in places in the world where there's super strong egos at work and super strong, like, dictator-type people throughout history. I mean, we can see, boy, that's where just horrific things happen. A lot of bloodshed or war, or even now, different strongmen or dictators in different countries, and that's where the conflict is horrible, or where the ideology is the strongest. And then does it make us feel more or less cooperative? And of course it makes us feel less cooperative, because once there's a strong sense of I and ego, then there's a real sense of I have something at stake that I need to protect here. So that strong I, that strong ego, wanting, not wanting, kind of that reactionary habit energy of the mind leads to a feeling of separateness and isolation, and it leads to a feeling of dis-ease. And of course, with intensity, the more intense that separation and that dis-ease. So just coming back to mindfulness, the practice of meditation, what we do, mindfulness of the body, what the body's doing, mindfulness of the mind, what the mind is doing. Simple mindfulness in the framework of the body and the mind. It means to be aware. And it's not just normal awareness or even heightened awareness, but that specific awareness of specific things in specific ways, and we've talked about this, but just that reminder that it is the body and what it's doing, its position, its movement or lack thereof, and the array of physical sensations resulting from it. The mind, what it's doing, its position, its movement or lack thereof, and the array of mental sensations resulting from it. And those mental sensations could also be called emotions. And then we're aware of it in specific ways. Objectively, not judging or evaluating, just observing. Because, of course, talking about all this, if you started to react to it judgmentally, then what happens? I mean, there's a closing off right away. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are real judgmental or harsh or critical of yourself or of others, it is the opposite of wisdom. You know, it's narrowing things down to a point where you just cannot see clearly anymore. So we observe as objectively as we can, not judging or evaluating, letting the observation be impersonal, not getting the I involved, and just noticing how just that simple part, you're not like giving up on your identity or your sense of self. You're just giving up on that real clinginess and neediness and stinginess that sort of comes up from that strong identity of self. And then you're aware that, hey, when I start to let go of that, boy, I just feel so much better. You know, I just feel so much more free. I feel so much more compassionate and generous and open. And I don't feel like I'm under attack anymore. It's such a wonderful, freeing way to feel. There's a few points left on this, but you know what? We'll pick it up next week and continue. But I think we're at a good place to stop because, you know, I think everybody kind of understands where we are. I'm going to stop this.